Emily Carter adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag and slid into her seat, third row from the front, exactly in line with the oak-paneled lectern where Professor Daniel Whitmore began his lecture each Wednesday morning. The lecture hall buzzed with idle chatter, but Emily sat still, her pen poised over a clean notebook page. The only sound she acknowledged was the soft shuffle of Daniel's footsteps as he entered, his tall frame composed, his expression unreadable behind rectangular glasses. He greeted the class with a nod and opened a worn copy of The Age of Innocence. His voice, deep and measured, filled the space with a steady cadence. Emily wasn't just listening, she was studying. Every inflection, every pause. Her friends often teased her about the intensity with which she approached literature. But they didn't understand. To Emily, words weren't just vessels for meaning. They were weapons, lifelines, secrets. Professor Whitmore, for his part, rarely acknowledged individual students. He taught with an elegance that suggested he spoke to the material more than the people. But when Emily raised her hand midway through his analysis of Newland Archer's restrained desire, he paused. "Yes, Miss Carter?" Her voice was calm, practiced. "Do you think Archer's restraint is admirable or cowardly? I mean, isn't restraint just a form of fear, dressed in moral fabric?" The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was electric. Daniel tilted his head, considering her question. "That's a bold interpretation," he said, "but not incorrect." His gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary, just long enough for Emily to feel it. After class, she lingered, packing her things slowly, while the rest of the students trickled out. Daniel remained behind, stacking his notes. She approached casually. "I liked your lecture," she said. He gave a polite nod. "Thank you. Your question was incisive." "I've been writing a piece on restraint," she said, carefully watching his reaction. "A short story. I'm trying to explore the gap between what we want and what we allow ourselves." Daniel hesitated, then gestured toward the open door of his office down the hall. "I have a few minutes if you'd like to talk about it." Inside, his office smelled faintly of old books and something cedar-like. The walls were lined with shelves of novels, poetry collections, and academic journals. Emily took in the space with quiet admiration, her fingers tracing the spine of a volume by Rilke. "So, what's the story about?" he asked, settling behind his desk. "It's about a girl who falls in love with an idea more than a person," she said. "She thinks she's in control, but she's not. She gives something away before she even knows it's missing." Daniel nodded slowly. "Sounds honest." She smiled. "Honesty makes people uncomfortable, especially when it reveals more about them than they're ready to admit." There was a flicker in his expression then, subtle, but real. It wasn't just academic interest. Emily felt it, a shift in the air, like the moment before a storm. She stood. "I should go." "Yes," he said, but didn't move. As she exited, she caught her reflection in the glass panel of his door. Her eyes were bright, unafraid. Later that week, Emily walked past his office again, intending to head straight to the library, but his voice stopped her. "Miss Carter." She turned. "Yes, Professor? I read your essay on narrative ambiguity. Very sharp work." "Thank you. Are you attending the literary dinner this Friday? The department's hosting it after the symposium." "I heard about it," she said. "Is it open to undergraduates?" "Technically, no. But rules bend for brilliance." His tone was dry, but not unkind. She laughed. "Are you inviting me?" "I am." The hotel was a few blocks from campus, a warm, wood-paneled restaurant tucked beneath ivy-covered walls. When Emily arrived, dressed in a black dress just formal enough to be respectable, the hostess informed her that the others had canceled. Professor Whitmore was already seated, a glass of red wine in hand. "Well," he said, standing as she approached. "Looks like it's just us." She took her seat. "Seems so." The dinner was filled with conversation that danced between literary theory and personal philosophy. They debated characters like real people, broken, beautiful, complicated. Over dessert, Emily asked the question she'd been circling all evening. "Are you happy, Professor?" He didn't answer immediately. "That's a complicated word." Try another one. He looked at her across the flickering candlelight. I'm settled.
Which isn't always the same thing.
You don't strike me as a man who settles. You'd be surprised, he said. We all settle in some way. For comfort, for duty, for peace. Even if it means giving up something we want. Especially then. There was silence. A warm silence, but charged. When the check arrived, he reached for it. She touched his wrist, lightly. You don't have to pay. I want to. He didn't move his hand from where hers had landed. The contact was brief, seconds at most, but the spark was undeniable. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves scattered across the sidewalk like pages from an old book. I'll walk you, he offered. They walked in silence for a while, the night crisp with the early bite of autumn. She glanced sideways at him. Tell me something you've never told anyone, she said. Daniel hesitated. When I was 20, I wanted to be a poet. I wrote obsessively. Pages and pages. But I stopped when I realized I was more afraid of being ordinary than I was passionate about writing. That's not ordinary, she whispered. That's human. He stopped walking. They were in front of the old library, closed now, the windows dark. You fascinate me, Emily. She looked up at him. I know. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Then she turned. Good night, Professor. As she walked away, she felt his gaze on her back, not invasive, not possessive, just present. In the distance, a bell tower chimed the hour. 10 o'clock. She didn't look back, but she smiled. Not the kind meant to declare presence, but a soft, tentative sound, as though the knocker wasn't entirely sure they should be there. Professor Daniel Whitmore looked up from the pages he had been grading, his mind still occupied with syntax and metaphors. Outside his office door, the hallway was quiet. It was after hours, past the time students usually lingered. Come in, he said, already knowing who it would be. Emily entered, holding a slim folder against her chest like a shield. Her hair was damp from the rain, her eyes bright despite the hour. I hope I'm not disturbing you, she said. Daniel gestured toward the chair across from his desk. I was grading papers. Disturbance is welcome. She smiled faintly and sat, placing the folder on his desk. This is the short story I mentioned. I thought, maybe you'd want to read it.
He didn't open it yet.
What made you write this one? Emily hesitated. It started as fiction. Then it stopped pretending. Their eyes met, and for a moment, silence pressed in around them again. Rain tapped softly against the window. The university was cloaked in evening stillness, as if the world had shrunk to the space between them. He reached for the folder. May I? She nodded. He flipped through the first few pages. The prose was elegant, spare but rich with subtext. A young woman, unnamed, falls into an intellectual entailed or professor. No overt romance, but the undercurrents were unmistakable, desire masked as admiration, boundaries blurred beneath long discussions and shared silences. She's brave, Daniel said, his voice low. The girl in the story. She's curious, Emily replied, and tired of pretending she doesn't understand her own power. Daniel set the pages down. You're aware this story is dangerous. To whom? To both of us. She stood then, slowly, as though testing the ground beneath her. She walked to the bookshelf, running a finger along the dusty spines. I used to think adults had it all figured out, she said. But you look like someone who used to dream about different things. Daniel rose from his chair, the distance between them suddenly feeling vast despite the closeness of the room. Emily. Her name wasn't a question or a reprimand. It was a warning wrapped in longing. She turned to face him. If I told you I think about you, would that be the end of everything?
He didn't answer. Couldn't.
The rules, the unspoken ones, the institutional ones, flared in his mind like red flags. But so did the image of her walking away again. And that thought felt heavier. I shouldn't have come, she whispered. But she didn't leave. Instead, she stepped closer, her breath shallow. The space between them was no longer academic, no longer safe. He reached out, almost unconsciously, brushing her fingers with his. She didn't pull away. The first kiss wasn't practiced or cinematic. It was tentative, restrained, but undeniably real. When they separated, she looked up at him with a soft defiance. "I'm not trying to ruin your life," she said. "I'm trying to step into mine." He closed his eyes briefly, as if to anchor himself. "This can't happen again." "I know."
But it did.
Their second meeting took place off campus, at a discreet cafe known more for its poetry readings than its food. They chose a corner table, hidden behind a bookshelf. The waitress didn't ask questions. Daniel watched her stir her coffee. Her fingers were ink-stained from writing. "I keep asking myself what this is," he said. Emily looked up. "You already know. You're just afraid to name it, because naming it makes it real. And real things break." He shook his head. "This isn't sustainable. You graduate, I stay behind. My marriage is a habit," she said gently, "not a home." Daniel didn't defend Lena. He couldn't. The distance between them had grown like ivy, slow, silent, and irreversible. "You deserve something simpler," he said. "I don't want simple," she replied. "I want something that reminds me I'm alive." She reached across the table, her hand grazing his. A small gesture, but in the right context, a revolution. As weeks passed, their meetings became routine. Every Wednesday after his evening seminar, Daniel would walk the long way to the parking garage, detouring through the art building, where Emily waited in a forgotten classroom. There, surrounded by easels and paint-stained rags, they existed outside the rules. He read her stories aloud, pausing to ask questions or offer notes. She listened intently, curled on a couch that smelled faintly of turpentine, her eyes fixed on him as though he were the final page of a book she didn't want to finish. One night, he asked her, "What would you write about us?" She thought for a moment. "I'd write about a man afraid of himself, and a girl who saw him clearly anyway." "That sounds tragic." She smiled. "Only if it ends too soon." One rainy night, they checked into a modest motel off the interstate. The room was anonymous, neutral carpet, beige walls, a single lamp casting a soft yellow glow. There were no declarations, no promises. Just the quiet unfolding of something neither could define. After, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Emily's head rested on his chest, her breathing steady. The room was still, yet his mind raced. "What are we doing?" he asked softly. Emily turned, resting her chin on his chest. "Something that probably ends badly." He laughed bitterly. "That's not comforting. It's honest." She sat up, pulling the sheet around her. "I know this won't last. But I also know I'll regret it more if we pretend it never happened." Daniel studied her in the dim light. "You sound older than you are." She reached for clothes. "Maybe I've lived more than most 20-year-olds. He didn't stop her as she dressed, didn't ask her to stay. When the door closed behind her, the silence that followed was thunderous. Back on campus, things shifted. Emily stopped lingering after lectures. Her hand no longer shot up with provocative questions. She arrived late, left early. The distance was strategic. Daniel noticed. So did others. Jason, a quiet but perceptive classmate of Emily's, watched her with a puzzled expression during seminars. Once, he stopped her outside the library. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine. You're just different lately." Emily gave him a polite smile. "Maybe I'm just seeing things more clearly." Jason didn't press further, but the question lingered. And then there was Lena. One evening, she found a folded paper inside Daniel's briefcase. A printed story, no title, no author name, just raw emotion on every page. She read it once, then again. When Daniel returned home, Lena was seated at the kitchen table, the story laid out before her like a crime scene. "Is this yours?" she asked. He hesitated.
No.
She nodded slowly. "But it's about you." He didn't answer. The silence spoke for him. Lena stood. "I don't need you to confess. I just need to know if this is the end." "I don't know. You always were better at theory than action." She walked away. The door closed with a finality that echoed through the house. That night, Daniel returned to campus long after midnight. He found himself outside the library, the same spot where Emily had once walked away from him. He waited, but she didn't come. Instead, he sat on the stone bench beneath the lamplight, the story still in his hand. The ink had begun to smudge in the rain. He read it again line by line. Each word a wound. Each silence a truth. Spring had crept in without permission, early blossoms on the trees, light breezes whispering across the quads, and students lounging under sunlight that had finally returned. But for Emily Carter, it felt as though winter still clung to her skin. She moved through the weeks with practiced indifference, avoiding eye contact, skipping the cafe where she and Daniel once met, and declining every invitation from curious classmates who had started to notice her absence from social circles. She had never intended to fall in love with him. That was the part that stung most. Not the secrecy, not the inevitable unraveling, but the tenderness of it all. She had thought herself in control, thought she had weaponized her intellect and curiosity to explore a boundary without crossing over. But she had crossed it, and now the ground beneath her felt foreign. In the back of her notebook, she scribbled down phrases she couldn't say aloud. It was never about power. It was about seeing someone and being seen in return. And now I am invisible again. One afternoon, as she sat under the clock tower with her knees pulled to her chest, Jason approached. He wasn't carrying books or his usual energy drink, just a quiet kind of concern. "You've been MIA," he said, sitting beside her. "I've been writing," she offered. He hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a folded slip of paper. "It's not mine. Found it in the creative writing lab printer. Figured you might know the author." Emily unfolded it slowly. It was her story, the one she'd given Daniel. But someone had changed the ending. Instead of quiet longing, the final paragraph now hinted at exposure, a student who had documented everything and planned to use it. A betrayal born not out of malice, but necessity. Self-preservation. Her breath caught. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice tight. "On the stack of print jobs. Anonymous. But I know your style." Emily stood abruptly. Her mind raced, not with fear, but with fury. The story was never meant for anyone else. It was sacred, personal, a coded confession in fiction's clothing. And now someone had twisted it. She went straight to the English department offices. Daniel wasn't in his office. A note pinned to his door read, "On leave until further notice." 3 short lines. Nothing else. The hallway felt too narrow. The air, too thin. Daniel had left quietly. The dean's inquiry had been swift. An anonymous tip, an email with attached pages of Emily's story, a note claiming impropriety. It didn't take much. The university had no patience for scandal. He was offered the choice to resign quietly or face a public review. He chose silence. He always had. Now he lived 2 towns over, renting a modest loft above an antique bookstore. He spent his mornings reading manuscripts no one would publish, and his nights replaying conversations he couldn't forget. Emily haunted him, not as a ghost, but as a question. Had he protected her by walking away? Or abandoned her in the very moment she needed clarity? The worst part wasn't losing his job. It wasn't even Lena, who had left quietly, too, taking only what she had brought into their 15-year marriage. The worst part was not knowing if Emily understood. One morning, he found an envelope in his mailbox. No name, no return address. Inside, a single page. "You said naming it made it real. I'm naming it now." It was love.
And you ran.
He sat down on the steps, the paper trembling in his hands. She wasn't just wounded, she was angry.
And rightfully so.
But she was also brave. And still writing. Back on campus, Emily began meeting with a faculty mentor, Professor Hargrove, a woman known for her bluntness and fiercely guarded privacy. Hargrove didn't ask about Daniel, but she read Emily's work with care, noting the rawness in her prose, the sharp intelligence that now carried bruises beneath the surface. "Have you considered submitting to the Northwell Prize?" Hargrove asked one day. Emily shook her head. "They don't take student work. They do if it comes through faculty recommendation, Hargrove said, then added. You have something to say. Say it to the world instead of hiding it in metaphors. Emily submitted the piece. Not the one about Daniel, but the one after. A story about consequence and courage, about a young woman who fell in love with her reflection in someone else's eyes and then had to learn how to see herself without it. It wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was honest. Weeks later, the results arrived in her inbox. She had won. The email was brief. Congratulations. Publication forthcoming. A modest grant for continued work. But the last line stood out. We were struck by the intimacy of your voice. It felt like a confession disguised as art. Emily closed her laptop and looked out the window. The campus buzzed with spring energy, students preparing for exams, professors scribbling notes across chalkboards. Life went on, indifferent and unburdened. She walked to the library, her favorite corner near the back stacks, and pulled out a battered copy of The Age of Innocence. Inside was a note, pressed between pages 204 and 205. Her own handwriting. I didn't know how to end us, so I left it unfinished. Maybe that's the point. She closed the book gently, as if sealing the memory for good. When she stepped outside, the sun was warm on her face. 3 months later, in a dimly lit auditorium in New York, the Northwell Prize ceremony began. Emily stood backstage, watching other writers receive their awards, clapping politely, adjusting the hem of her dress. When her name was called, the room greeted her with a murmur of curiosity. She was the youngest winner in the prize's history. At the podium, she took a breath. I wrote the story that won this prize during a time when I didn't know how to tell the truth directly, she said. I wrote it because I needed to understand myself, not just the person I was becoming, but the person I had allowed someone else to shape. She looked across the crowd, imagining Daniel somewhere in the darkness. We don't always get closure, she continued, but we get clarity. And with clarity, we write new endings. She stepped down to the sound of applause. Not deafening, but sincere. Outside the venue, the night air smelled of rain. A cab pulled up, and as she climbed in, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. I read your story. You found the ending. I'm proud of you.
D.
She stared at the screen for a long time. Then, without replying, she turned the phone off, leaned back, and watched the city lights blur past. There were no more secrets left to tell. Just stories waiting to begin.